On February 1st, 2023, the citizens of Billings, Montana noticed a strange object flying in the skies over their town. On February 4th, the United States Air Force shot down another one of these objects that was reported over U.S. territorial waters near the coast of South Carolina. In fact, starting on January 28, 2023, other similar objects were seen flying over the United States state of Alaska in western Canada, on top of the two previously mentioned. While on the surface, these may seem like isolated incidents of objects that may have flown off course, the reality of it presents a much larger problem. Because, as confirmed by US and Canadian intelligence, these are Chinese weather balloons that are equipped with intelligence equipment and have the ability to locate and tap onto communication networks. And with the already fragile relationship between America and China, this incident could push things over the edge. According to US intelligence, these few balloons spotted across North America were only part of the situation. On February 9th, the United States claimed that more Chinese balloons flew over 40 other countries, and this was the fifth sighting of Chinese balloons over the United States since 2017, with sightings over Hawaii, Florida, and Guam. None of these incidents, however, has sparked up as retaliation from both countries as the one in this year. So in this video, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the response from both China and the United States. According to a spokesperson from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs by the name of Wang Wenbin, the United States has flown over 10 balloons over Chinese airspace since just 2022, without permission from the Chinese government. In response to this, White House National Security Council spokesperson Jack Kirby said that these allegations were completely false. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken told NATO top officials at a press conference earlier this month that the spy balloons were part of a surveillance program by China, in which the purpose is to gather intelligence from targets around the globe. These balloons couldn't have come at a worse time, however, when considering the United States and Chinese relations and with regard to Taiwan. The United States and China have a long and complicated history dating all the way back to the 1800s. In 1845, the United States signed the Treaty of Wanghia with China. This is an important part of the history to understand between these two powers because this is what kickstarted U.S.-Chinese relations. This treaty, imposed by the United States, gave the U.S. access to treaty ports in China, similar to the Nanking Treaty imposed by the British just 3 years prior. The Wanghia Treaty also gave the United States fixed tariffs on trade with China, the right to buy land in 5 of China's treaty ports, and perhaps most crucially, at the time of the treaty, most favored nation status. This was important because in the 1840s, the U.S. wasn't a global superpower by any means like it is now. So by the U.S. receiving priority status with China, it meant that the United States would receive the same benefits as European powers like Britain. In the 1900s, the United States made another move to combat the European powers in China by promoting the open door policy, which was a diplomatic policy established by the United States that called for equal trade and investment by outside powers with the Qing dynasty. It was meant to encircle the European powers and stop them from carving China into colonies, like they had done in Africa. The open door policy was also in part to establish American economic forces as the primary economic power in Chinese markets. As the 20th century progressed, U.S.-China relations progressed as well, especially when the imperialist and expansionist Japanese Empire invaded Manchuria in China in the 1930s, in which the United States imposed severe sanctions on Japan, limiting the country's access to resources. Despite the friendliness between the United States and China in the first half of the 20th century, the second half would be much different. Since 1949, U.S.-China relations have been in a downward spiral. In October of 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, established the People's Republic of China after the Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army defeated the Republic of China government in the Chinese Civil War. The remaining nationalists of the ROC government fled to the island of Taiwan, and from this point, the United States has supported the Republic of China and Taiwan ever since. This resulted in the U.S. signing a mutual defense treaty with the ROC in 1954, and when mainland China shelled the island around Taiwan, the U.S. threatened them with nuclear war. However, in 1964, China conducted their first successful nuclear test, showing to the world and to the United States the power that they now held. At the same time, all eyes were on the small southeastern Asian country of Vietnam, which during World War II was under Japanese occupation. Since 1877, Vietnam was also a colonial possession of France. During World War II, however, the Vietnamese people, led by communist and political leader Ho Chi Minh, fought against both colonial forces. After World War II ended and the Japanese were forced out of Vietnam, Emperor Bao Dai was put in control, who was French educated and Western aligned. Ho Chi Minh and his followers saw this as an opportunity to take control of Vietnam, and they captured the city of Hanoi in northern Vietnam, setting up the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under communist rule. In response, France backed Emperor Dao and established the state of Vietnam with the capital at Saigon. Numerous battles happened, and a treaty following the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 split Vietnam into two parts along the 17th parallel, similar to what had been done in Korea. The North was a communist regime aligned with the ideals of China, while the South was a capitalist and Western aligned nation. The United States sent supplies to aid the Southern government in arresting Northern sympathizers that lived in the South. In response, many groups opposed to the South Vietnam government started revolting. The United States, operating under the assumption that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asia's countries would too, sent hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam, and the fighting that ensued would go on to kill or wound hundreds of thousands of Americans, prompting a large anti-war movement in the United States. Starting in the 1970s, China and the United States started making attempts to normalize relations between themselves. In July 1971, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger secretly visited China, and after his visit, the People's Republic of China was officially recognized by the United Nations and received a permanent seat on the Security Council over Taiwan and the Republic of China. In 1979, U.S. President Jimmy Carter acknowledged the One China policy and started severing ties with Taiwan. In the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the United States continued to try to improve relations with China, and in 1984, the U.S. allowed China to purchase U.S. military equipment. However, in response to the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989 that left hundreds of protesters dead, the U.S. cut off their military equipment sales to China. The turn of the century escalated the relations between the U.S. and China. As I outlined in my video titled How China Controls the World, China has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world, along with one of the largest trading partners for a majority of South America, Africa, and Asia. The US and China, however, are seeking to grow closer together, and in 2006, China surpassed Mexico as the US's second biggest trading partner, behind only Canada. China was a big help to the United States in bringing countries like North Korea and Iran into the international system, seeing how both of those countries are geopolitical enemies of the United States. Throughout the 2000s, China and the United States seek to lower tensions between themselves, but their two polar opposite political ideologies would cause some issues to rise. The 2008 financial crisis that swept up the world and perhaps its biggest impact on China in the realm of trade. From a financial sense, China wasn't affected as much as other countries because it wasn't very well integrated with the global financial network. However, the real impact was in trade. In a span of just a few months, exports out of China declined by over one-third, and over 20 million people were left unemployed. Whilst China's economy has recovered since then, it has left a lasting impact on trade in and out of China. You see, the United States imports more than China than it exports from China, which results in an imbalanced U.S. trade deficit, which is the difference in money between a country's imports and exports, with China sitting at $375.6 billion in 2017. Because of this highly imbalanced trade deficit, multiple administrations in the United States have imposed tariffs on imports from China in order to shield U.S. producers from economic harm. When Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, he made this an important part of his campaign. Along with the tariffs against China came restricted access to U.S.-made technology and investment, and since taking office in 2020, President Joe Biden has further doubled down on these policies made by President Trump. But these U.S. trade deficits with China present a much larger problem to the United States economy than on the surface. Trade deficits are not a good way to measure how well the economy is in relation to the country's trade policies and are driven by the country's own federal budget deficits. This has little to do with China's own economy, so there's little incentive for the Chinese. Besides, since Trump announced his policies on the trade deficit, bilateral trade between China and the United States has reached an all-time high, which has only served to worsen the trade deficit. It's these economic problems that the United States is facing that are worsening its relationship with China. But the catalyst to all the geopolitical rivalries that the US and China are facing each other with in 2022 and 2023 is, of course, Taiwan. This past winter, mainland China dispatched 71 aircraft over the island, along with hundreds of flights and several military exercises in the past year. Since U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi visited the island back in August of 2022, Beijing has increased her nuclear warhead stockpile, along with new technology and additional modernizations to her military. All of this puts the U.S. in a massive dilemma. Should Washington intervene to fend off an attack on Taiwan from Beijing and further harm U.S.-Chinese relations, or should the United States stay out of China's way? Whatever the case is, East Asia is hanging in a fragile state of balance. The threat of U.S. retaliation has kept Beijing from declaring war on Taiwan, and the fear of being abandoned by the United States keeps Taiwan from officially declaring independence from mainland China. Since 2021, China's military budget has increased over 500%, and she now holds the world's largest missile arsenal, second largest navy, and third largest air force. In 1996, Beijing fired missiles at Taiwan, but stopped when the United States sent 2 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Strait. However, seeing how China has been rapidly increasing her military, it's uncertain how Beijing would react to U.S. intervention in the strait again, and could even risk the possibility of war between these two global powers. Now that we know about the deep political history between the United States and China, along with the recent heat over Taiwan between these two global superpowers, the threat of the spy balloons seen over the North American continent becomes even worse. Should the United States or China take more decisive action in regard to the Chinese balloons seen over America, or if Chinese allegations of U.S. spy equipment over Chinese airspace are true, then the already fragile relationship between the U.S. and China could be fractured beyond repair. This year and this decade will be crucial between the United States and China. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the Global Archive. Thank you.